Hi, you all. Welcome and good evening, and thank you for joining us for this lecture by New York Times bestselling author William Deresiewicz entitled College and the Inner Life. I'm Ben Story of the Department of Politics and International Affairs, and I'm the co-director of Furman's Tocqueville program, which is sponsoring this afternoon's lecture. Before we begin, let me ask everybody to turn off your electronics, please, before we get started. So the Tocqueville program exists to sponsor serious and open engagement with the moral and philosophic questions at the heart of political life. For students or others who are curious about who we are and what we do, please avail yourselves of the materials on the table outside this room, which detail a number of ways to get involved with us, our courses, and the wonderful group of students who participate in the activities of the Tocqueville program. In particular, we run a political thought club that meets on Friday afternoons, and that group is about to start a new set of readings this week, a series of essays by the philosopher farmer Wendell Berry, who's a very interesting figure. We meet at Fridays at 2:30 in the seminar rooms in the political science department in Johns Hall, and everybody is welcome if you'd like to join us for that. I also want to briefly thank our sponsors, Ginny and Sandy McNeil, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the Andrea Waite Carlton Family Foundation, the family of Jane Gage Hipp, the Strata Education Network, and many others, including some of our former students who support the Tocqueville program. Today's lecture in particular is sponsored by the Ernest J. Walters Lecture Series in Political Thought. The Walters Lecture Series was established in 2001 to honor the life and legacy of Professor J. Walters. Professor Walters dedicated his professional career to Furman University, teaching in the Department of Political Science for 27 years. After his death in 1997, members of the Political Science Department decided that there could be no better way to honor his contribution than to continue his legacy with yearly visits by distinguished lecturers in the area of political thought, broadly understood. This annual memorial lectureship has been established by the students Professor Walters inspired and the friends and family he cherished, and we're very grateful that Terry and Amy Walters are here with us today. So the theme of this year's lecture series is love, friendship, and politics. We were moved to design a series around that theme, in part because of the unsettling testimonies of loneliness we have heard from the bright and charming young people with whom we are so fortunate to be surrounded every day. Those young people are, moreover, in some ways more connected than ever, constantly in touch with people near and far through the astonishing powers of our digital devices. So why do so many of them experience college, which would seem to be a time of peak ripeness for both romance and the connections of friendship, as a time of restless isolation? Does that sense of isolation, which spreads far beyond the college campus, have anything to do with the profound unsettledness of our politics in this era of the presidency of Donald Trump? We could think of no one better suited to speak to the question of the strange loneliness that pervades the college campus than William Deresiewicz. Dr. Deresiewicz was a professor at Yale until 2008, and he's the author of the landmark essays, The Disadvantages of an Elite Education and Solitude in Leadership. He's also a frequent speaker on campuses around the country. A contributing writer for The Nation and a contributing editor for The New Republic and The American Scholar, he's the author of A Jane Austen Education, How 6 Novels Taught Me About Love, Friendship, and the Things That Really Matter, and Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. It's for the latter book's diagnosis of the state of campus life in our time that we asked him to come talk to us today. Please join me in welcoming William Deresiewicz for College and the Inner Life.
Hi, thanks for coming. This weather is probably completely normal for you, but I live in Portland, Oregon, so I would not be indoors on a day like today. So I'm especially grateful for you to come. I hope I can live up to that introduction. I worry that my talk's going to be perhaps a little off-center from the topic, but I think you'll find connections anyway. Also, I have to update my bio because I've been thrown off 2 of those 3 mastheads you mentioned. Actually, I walked off one of them, and then the other one, they took me off. They didn't even tell me. It doesn't matter, because those positions don't actually come with anything, so it doesn't even matter. But let's get started. I'm going to talk about college in the inner life, meaning ultimately how college can and should prepare you for the experiences of love and friendship, give you a deeper capacity for them. But I'm also going to talk about college and the public life, the outer life. In other words, how college should help equip you for political participation. And I think that ultimately these things should be related. So, what's the phrase that we increasingly hear with respect to college in public and even private discussions? The phrase that I often hear is return on investment. Actually, I was on the Fox Business Channel. I was on for 3 minutes, because that's how long those segments are. I didn't realize it was going to be 3 minutes, and then he said, "Thank you very much," at the end of 3 minutes, and I thought, I guess he didn't like what I said. But then somebody else said, "No, it's always like that. It's only 3 minutes." But what I thought he didn't like was because he said, "Well, what's the return on investment of college?" And I said, well, meaning, of course, is it worth it financially to go to college? What are you going to get in terms of the amount of money you put in, debt, or just tuition or whatever? Is it going to be worth it financially? And that's when it hit me, like, well, what is the return that college is supposed to give you, right? And that's what I said to him. Is it just about earning more money? Is the only purpose of education to enable you to get a job or to set you up for a career? What is this whole college thing for? Because we talk in the overheated conversation that we've been having about higher education for the last few years, we talk about soaring tuition, rising student debt, and the daunting labor market for new graduates, although it's not as daunting as it was a few years ago. We talk about the future of the university, things like budget squeezes, distance learning, massive open online courses, and whether college in its present form is even necessary. We talk about national competitiveness, about the 21st century labor force, about technology and engineering, about the outlook for our future prosperity and what relationship college should play to it. But we never talk about the premise that underlies these conversations, as if what makes for a happy life and a good society were simply self-evident, and if in either case the exclusive answer was more money. Now, I want to say that money matters, and all the things that I just ticked off, they also matter. Financial security, national prosperity. The question is, are they the only things that matter? And if you've been studying political philosophy, you know that this is the question that people have been asking for a long time. Life, after all, is more than a job, and a job is more than a paycheck, and a country is more than its wealth. And education is more, or should be more, than the acquisition of marketable skills. And finally, you are more than your ability to contribute to your employer's bottom line or to the nation's GDP, no matter what the rhetoric of politicians or business executives would have you think. So when you ask what college is for, you're asking what life is for, what society is for. Or in the words of Wendell Berry, I wish I could be here for that. He's one of my old heroes. In the words of Wendell Berry, what are people for? You need to get a job, you also need to get a life. When I hear people talk about, the return on investment of college, I think, well, what's the return on investment of having children? I would say that children are probably a net negative, financially speaking. Or spending time with friends, or listening to music, or reading a book. The things that are most worth doing are worth doing for their own sake. And I hope that college is something that's worth doing for its own sake. Anyone who tells you that the sole purpose of education is the acquisition of negotiable skills, and there are a lot of people who will tell you that now. Many of them are governors of states, is attempting to reduce you to a productive employee at work, a docile consumer in the market, and a subject of the state. What's at stake when we ask what college is for is nothing less than our ability to remain fully human. I know that that sounds grandiose, but I think it's true. So what's college for? What does college have to do with the inner life? Well, the cliche is that the purpose of college is to teach you to think. It's a cliche, but which means that it's been emptied of meaning. But like a lot of cliches, I think it actually used to mean something. And I think it's not the thing that's usually intended. Which, in other words, it's not just developing the mental skills particular to individual disciplines. How to conduct a study in social science, how to read a text in a literature class, how to do a study in a lab. And not even acquiring the ability to work across disciplines, to integrate disparate intellectual approaches, although those are also good things to know. I think that it fundamentally means developing the habit of skepticism and the capacity to put it into practice. It means learning not to take things for granted, right? I mean, we're all born into this world, and when we're kids, I think it's just, the world is just the world, and our parents are just the parents, and the sky is blue because what other color would it be? And then you start, or ought to start, to think about the fact that all of these things are true for a reason. And a physicist can tell you why the sky is blue and not another color. But you don't arrive in college a blank slate, right? I think before you can learn, you have to unlearn. And this is why skepticism is so important. Not taking things for granted is so important. You arrive in college having already been inscribed with all the ways of thinking and feeling that the world has been instilling in you since the moment you were born. The myths, the narratives, the pieties, the assumptions, the sacred words. Sacred words like, a sacred word is a word that is felt to constitute its own argument, like innovation. It's innovation, it's got to be good, and we all know what it means. Or social justice, for that matter, or lots of all the words that we use automatically, or terms that we use automatically. It might be said that society is a conspiracy to keep itself from the truth. We pass our lives submerged in propaganda, advertising messages, political rhetoric, the journalistic affirmation of the status quo, the platitudes of popular culture, the axioms of party, sect, and class, the bromides we exchange every day on Facebook, the comforting lies our parents tell us and the sociable ones our friends do, the steady stream of falsehoods that we each tell ourselves all the time to stave off the threat of self-knowledge. Again, as many of you probably know better than I do, because I'm not really well versed in political philosophy when it comes down to it, Plato had a word for all of this, and the word was doxa, opinion. It's the root of words like orthodox or heterodox. And I want to emphasize that doxa is as powerful a force among progressives as among conservatives, in Massachusetts as in upstate South Carolina, for atheists as for fundamentalists. All of us have this. All of us are possessed by it. In a sense, doxa is not the things that we think, it's the things that think us. So the first purpose of a real education, of a liberal arts education, of a college education, is to liberate us from doxa by teaching us to recognize it, to question it, to think our way around it. There's a wonderful English professor at UVA named Mark Edmondson, who's one of my favorite writers on the humanities, on college education, and he's got a great book called Teacher. It's about a teacher. It's actually a teacher he had in high school. He was 17. And he talks about how his teacher kind of saved him by teaching him to do this. And indeed, his teacher's methods were the same as those of Socrates, Plato's own teacher. He echoed his students' opinions back to them or forced them to articulate them for themselves. Just that simple. Tell me what you think, now tell me why. And in some sense, everything important in education can unfold from those questions. By dragging them into the light, asking you to defend them or just acknowledge having them, he began to break those opinions down, to expose them to the operations of the critical intelligence, which is to say, to develop that intelligence in the first place. The point was not to replace his students' opinions with his own. The point was to bring his students into the unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and endlessly fertile condition of doubt, to teach them not what to think, but how. If you find yourself in a classroom where a teacher is trying to teach you what to think, you should look for the door. And I know that there are people who do this now, in college, in high school. They're trying to, well, we can talk about this later, if you want. No, college isn't the real world, as people often denigrate it by saying, and that's precisely the point. It gives you a chance to stand outside the world for a few years and to contemplate things from a distance. And it gives you that chance at the perfect time in your life, if you're a traditional college student, age-wise, which I take it seems like you all are, maybe almost all of you are, right? Developmentally speaking, the perfect time to do this. You leave the certainties of your family, and before you're engulfed by the world, before you're ingested, digested, and ultimately excreted by the job market, it's not necessarily as bad as all of that. You have a chance to think about things. Also, college offers you professors. And I've been hearing great things about the professors here. And if you find yourself at a school where your professors are very available to talk to you and always have lots of time for you, you are really, really, really lucky, okay? You're like in the top 1% of college students in that respect, and you should really take advantage of it. A professor's most important role is to make you think with rigor, precisely, patiently, responsibly, remorselessly, and not only about your deepest ingrained suppositions, which I was just talking about, but also, in the words of my professor, this is one of the many reasons I loved him, about your most exhilarating, he wrote this, about your most exhilarating new insights, most of which turn out to be fallacious. You want some people in your life whose job it is to tell you that you're wrong. Very few people are going to do this, okay? Normally they just hit like, okay? It's really good to have people who are going to tell you that you're wrong. And there are not that many people outside of college who are going to do that. College also gives you peers with whom to question and debate the ideas you encounter in the classroom. And I hear that you guys do this here. And again, that's become really unusual, including at schools that think of themselves as the best schools in the country. Believe me, because I've taught at some of them. Partly because students tend to be too busy, or they think that it's, I don't know, silly. The classroom and the dorm room are two ends of the same idea. The first puts things in your head, puts ideas in your head. The second makes them part of your soul. Those late night conversations, right? The first requires stringency, the second offers freedom. The first is normative, the second is subversive. Louis Lapham, the former editor and publisher of Harper's, wrote, most of what I learned in college, I learned in what I now remember as one long wayward conversation in the only all-night restaurant on Chapel Street. The topics under discussion: God, man, existence, Alfred Prufrock's Peach, were borrowed from the same anthology of large abstractions that supplied the texts for English 10 or Philosophy 116. But the learning happened in the diner. The classroom is the grain of sand, but it's up to you to play the oyster and make the pearl. You know, people sometimes say, well, are you saying that if you don't go to college, you're not going to learn how to think? Like, isn't that a really condescending thing to say? I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, you're in college. That's why you're in this room. If you're in college, this is the most important thing for you to do. It's not the only chance to learn to think. It's not the first chance. It's not the last chance. It probably is the best chance. And if you haven't started to do it by the time you graduate, again, the exigencies of the job market are such that it makes it very difficult afterwards. The purpose of college, or the first purpose, the central purpose, is to enable you to live more alertly, more responsibly, more freely, more fully. I was talking with a couple of seniors on a visit to a women's college a few years ago, and one of them said, "The question I leave college with is how to put my feminist ideals into practice as I go forward." I liked ideals, which is a word that I don't hear as much as I would like to, but I really loved question. A real education sends you into the world bearing questions, not resumes. But learning how to think is only the beginning, right? Or I should say, there's one particular thing that you need to learn how to think about. Another professor I had who had a profound impact on me would say to his freshmen the first day of class, you're here for very selfish reasons. I mean, just that, I think, is terrific. And we can talk about all of this. I'm not going to talk about it in my talk, but the whole change the world rhetoric, which is kind of another sacred phrase, I think is something that needs to be looked at a little bit. You're here for selfish reasons. Primarily, you're here for, and it's okay that you are. But what's this selfish reason? You're here, he said, to build a self, which is a very strange thing to say, and when I first heard it, I thought it was very strange myself. And then later I read something that David Foster Wallace wrote, the late great novelist who I think was maybe the greatest mind of my generation. He's right around the same age as me. He said that we taught today's young people that a self is something you just have. The only thing I disagree about that with is that today's young people, I think we've always taught people that a self is something you just have. So what does that mean? Well, I mean, you have a self when you're a little kid, but I mean, who wants to go through life with the self of a 3-year-old or a 10-year-old? There's not that much to it, right? So I think in this connection, because I was an English guy, not a political science guy, I think of a famous phrase from the letters of John Keats, the great English Romantic poet, who's considered to have written some of the greatest letters in the English language, many of them to his brother, where he kind of worked out his ideas. He died when he was 25, by the way. So really, you should get moving. So I don't know how old he was when he wrote this exactly, but it was not much older than you, maybe not older than you at all. He has a letter where he calls the world a vale of soul-making. Now, I know that there are a fair number of religious students at Furman, so maybe a lot of you recognize the reference to the traditional Christian idea of the world as a vale of tears, V-A-L-E, right? A valley of tears, a valley of sorrow. The world understood as a valley of sorrow through which the soul, which pre-exists our earthly life, is compelled to pass through, suffer through, on its way to a destination that lies beyond life, that lies beyond this world. Keats is challenging that. He's saying, well, no, our soul is our earthly self in this existence on this earth, in this life. And not only that, it doesn't precede our life. It isn't implanted in us when we're born, like from a receptacle that God takes off a shelf. It is created through our experience. And it has to do with not just matters of sin and virtue, but everything. Moral, but also emotional and sensual and sexual and emotional and everything. He writes to his brother, "Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul?" I think by intelligence here, he just means what we would call consciousness. So for Keats, the world is a scene of sorrow, yeah, but it's also a scene of joy and pleasure and actually, as he says, a place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. So the heart feels, meaning we experience things, and the intelligence or the consciousness is educated by reflecting on that feeling. Okay? You can't do this just by gazing at your navel or taking a class. You have to have experiences, but it's not enough just to have experiences. It's precisely through this act of introspection or self-examination, in Keats's terms, that you become an individual, a unique being, a soul, a self. I think the principal purpose of college is to help you, or if need be to force you, to make your way through the veil of soul making. And all the things around you, including or especially your fellow students, are there to help you do that, as incitements, as invitations, as opportunities. Alan Bloom wrote, "True liberal education requires that the student's whole life be radically changed. It puts everything at risk and requires students who are able to risk everything." This is not a comfortable process, but and I'm speaking from my own experience, it's an exhilarating one. If it happens right, it feels like you're being broken open. It feels, and pardon the image, it feels like you're giving birth to yourself. Lapham quotes an old professor who said that an education is a self-inflicted wound. So I've used the phrase liberal education or liberal arts education a couple of times, and I want to be a little clear about what it means, especially because it's a phrase that's used all the time, and generally speaking by people who actually don't know what it means. I even had a conversation with the president of a liberal arts college once. Admittedly, he had just become president, and he had come from a law school, and he was kind of a jerk, and I had a meeting with him, an audience really, a royal audience, and he said, "You know, I got here 3 months ago, and no one's been able to tell me what the liberal arts are." So I gave him my definition, which I really think is it's not my definition, it's really the standard definition, and then he said, no, you're wrong. So I thought, okay, well, that's why no one's been able to tell you. Liberal arts have nothing to do with liberalism in the political sense, and it's unfortunate for the liberal arts that they seem to. They also have nothing to do with the arts. They're not actually, music and fine arts are not liberal arts subjects. As great subjects as they are, they're not liberal arts. Liberal arts also not defined as everything your parents wish you wouldn't study, although that does seem to be the operating definition. They include the humanities, but they're not equal to the humanities, which is often how they're used. Liberal arts are classically defined as those fields in which knowledge is pursued for their own sake. Knowledge is pursued for its own sake. So it's distinguished from vocational fields like nursing or business or even engineering, where the mission of the field is to apply knowledge. That's why basic science subjects like physics, chemistry, biology are liberal arts, and they are as much liberal arts as history or literature or philosophy or religious studies, and so are social sciences, including economics, which is one of these classically practical subjects, but economics is also a liberal art. What that means is that when you study the liberal arts, you don't just learn stuff. In fact, a good liberal arts classroom will not be about transmitting stuff. Really, the professor should say, read chapter so-and-so or read such and such a book, learn it for yourself, and then we'll come back to class, and what are we going to do? We're going to discuss it. We're going to debate it. Really, what you should learn is how knowledge is created, so you can create knowledge yourself. How do we know this thing in the textbook is true? What experiments or whatever established it as true? What further questions does it raise? What are the methods that underlie the discipline as a whole? How is the discipline itself constituted? Which means, in this age of information, that you learn that there actually is no such thing as information. There are no such things as facts. There are only arguments. Now, I know that sounds very postmodern. I don't consider myself a postmodernist, whatever that means. Really, I think it's really not postmodern, it's modern. This is what the age of science, which started in the 16th century, told us, right? Every fact, if you look at it hard enough, you realize it has been created by an argument. Historical facts, scientific facts. I mean, lots of facts are settled enough for us to just call them facts. I mean, the theory of gravity you could probably call that a fact. But everything has been created by an argument, so much so that we can say that a fact is really nothing more than a frozen argument, a place where a certain line of thinking has come temporarily to rest. Every fact is susceptible to being overturned by a further argument. And we can indeed reflect in this connection on the fact that, on the circumstance, that the word that science uses for the things that it knows with the greatest degree of certainty is what? I guess it does use law sometimes. So I've made the mistake of asking a question that has and you gave me the wrong answer, but it's not the wrong answer. But actually, more generally, what's the word that science uses for things that it knows with the greatest degree of certainty? It's theory, right? Yeah. It's okay. I'll give you credit for law. But think about that, right? I mean, just to become a theory, a scientific idea has to clear a very high bar. Most things do not get even to the level of theory, and nothing gets high. There's nothing higher than a theory in science, and not just in science. The historian Simon Schama tells the story of a student who approached him after a lecture to complain that his father hadn't sent him to Harvard to become more confused. And Schama's thought was, well, actually, he did, or at least he should have. Probably he sent him to Harvard to become a banker. So it's true that he didn't send him to become more confused. But the point is that college is the place to learn that most of what we believe, and indeed history is exemplary in this regard, is much more provisional and complicated than we usually care to admit. This may sound like mental masturbation, the pointless multiplication of complexity and nuance, the endless entertainment of theories, hypotheses, and alternatives, everything that people mean by the word academic in the pejorative sense. But what it really is an honest confrontation with reality. And again, honesty is very hard to come by in this respect, too. The world is full of immensely complicated, complex, intricate things, the structure of an enzyme, the language of a Shakespeare play, the workings of a modern economy. Despite our desire for clear and simple answers, the truth is very hard to come by. So to receive a liberal arts education is to begin to understand that. It's also more. In this country, more or less uniquely, we do this weird thing in college where you have a major. So and in other countries, it's not that you get to study anything you want. You don't not have a major in that sense. Quite the opposite. You only study one thing. You specialize. If you're a chemistry student, you study chemistry, period. Here we have this different idea, that you study a range of subjects so that you don't just learn how to think, you learn that there are different ways to think. You learn what a physicist means by reality, and then you learn what a philosopher does. You study human behavior in psychology, and then you study it in literature. So your mind becomes more agile and resourceful, as well as more skeptical and rigorous. And most important of all, you learn to teach yourself. Now, I'm not going to go, I'm going to skim through this part because I don't want to take time away from other things. But this is why liberal arts majors are so highly valued in the workforce. I know that sounds crazy, but study after study shows that is the case. Most of what companies value in employees, especially employees that they're hiring for jobs that involve any kind of chance of advancement, that aren't just standing behind a counter or behind an assembly line. Most of the things that most of the skills they're looking for are not specific to particular disciplines. You can learn them in any subject as long as you're getting a real rigorous liberal arts education, like critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, communications, all the stuff that in poll after poll of CEOs and lots of other people, they ask, what are the most important things for success in the 21st century economy? These are the things that always take the top slots. Creativity, problem solving, critical thinking. Cross-cultural knowledge, also a big one. Communications, a big one. Larry Summers, Secretary of Treasury, President of Harvard, wrote, increasingly anything you learn is going to become obsolete within a decade. Any particular, fact or information. The most important kind of learning, he said, is about how to learn. I could go on. I have all these quotes. I'm going to skip them. My favorite one comes from David Rubenstein, who is a big hedge fund manager. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, I think in 2012, he gave a talk where he said that when it comes to hiring, his formula is H equals MC, which means humanities equals more cash. So I'm giving you this argument about practical utility because I want you to, it may depend on your family circumstances, on your life circumstances. I'm not saying that you could just blithely, stroll into the job market and everything's going to be fine, but I do want you to understand the idea that a liberal arts major is a ticket to unemployment or poverty is foolish. But needless to say, I don't think this is just like the piece of meat that I slip to the guard dog so I can get through the gate, so you'll listen to the rest of it, because I don't think this is the most important thing, right? I think it's the kinds of things I was talking about. Learning to reflect in the widest and deepest sense. For the sake of citizenship, for the sake of living well with others, for the sake of building a self, to return to the theme of the lecture series, that can enter deeply and compassionately into relationships of love and friendship. Getting a liberal education is about learning to become a more reflective human being, to confront the questions that life imposes on you, right? To think about the world and your place in the world. Not questions that are particular to any kind of profession or specialty, but to human beings as such, right? Which now are questions not of fact, which is what I was talking about before, but of value, right? Not of is, but of ought. As Tolstoy put it, what should we do and how should we live? Now, here I'm going to say, and I know I'm saying this in a room full of political scientists, so I may get in trouble, but I do think that the humanities in particular are in this respect central to a proper college education. Of course, political philosophy would be the one exception within the social sciences. So I guess I'm okay now. But scientists often don't like me to say this. And I should say I have the highest respect. I was a science major myself, believe it or not. My father was a science professor. I'm not against science. But I think the humanities, philosophy, literary studies, religious studies, history also, do things that other disciplines don't, which is exactly to pose those questions that come to us as individuals, as people, not as specialists. Questions of love and friendship, and death and family and morality, and time and truth and God. Questions of meaning, purpose, freedom, justice. A lot of the humanities in particular involve the study of the arts. They're not about creating art, but they're about principally, and I'm going back to my home discipline of English studies, the study of literature. So why would we want to spend our time studying the arts? Especially since I just made this huge song and dance about the liberal arts and how they create knowledge through essentially scientific methods of making arguments. The arts do not make arguments. How does art get to the truth? How do artists manage it? Well, I think it comes down to something very simple and at the same time very profound. By looking very hard and long at what's right in front of them, and then working very hard and long to tell us what they saw. And I mean this quite literally. If you've ever tried to paint something, draw something, how difficult it is Never mind actually the manual skill of representing it on paper or canvas, but just the cognitive skill of actually seeing what's in front of you. You know, I took a class, I'm not going to go into what kind of class it was, but when I was a couple of years after college already, I took a class that began by asking us to do this, by asking us to just look at something. And there was this world that I had never noticed before. And that world was the world. Okay, so if you look at a cup of water, if you really look at it, instead of just reaching for it, you see the liquid color of the glass. You might see the fingerprint smudges around the middle, maybe the rim of light at the meniscus. You know, the meniscus is that little divot at the top of a water, column of water. The kind of translucent shadow that the whole thing casts. Vladimir Nabokov, who's a very arrogant guy, in addition to being a very great writer, said that most people go through their whole lives never noticing that shadows have colors. So next time you have a chance, start to notice these things. I mean, you can spend your whole life doing it. So that to me is sort of the essential thing that art does. In literature, it tends to be less the physical world and more the social or psychological world. So a poet might tell us what she really feels about her body or her sister, not what she's supposed to feel. The novelist reports upon the way we really treat each other, the pettiness or callousness or secret irrational longing, not the way we say we do. Those conventional modes of thinking and feeling that I was talking about before, that we need to free ourselves from, the party lines we spout, the happy talk that we're surrounded by, that's exactly what art does its work by breaking through. Kafka said that a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. I mean, reading for entertainment is fine, but really, and notice how this echoes that wound metaphor from before, the axe for the frozen sea within us. Another one of my personal heroes was a 19th century English writer who unfortunately isn't as well known anymore, named John Ruskin, who was the greatest art critic of the 19th century. He really taught the whole 19th century how to look, how to see. And then he became one of its greatest social critics. And I don't think that that's an accident. I actually heard Zadie Smith give a talk a couple of years ago where she connected that. You know, she's a novelist, and she connected the aesthetic, the seeing, with the moral. She said, before you mind something, you have to be mindful of it. You have to notice it. Ruskin said, the more I think of it, I find this conclusion more impressed upon me, that the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and to tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one, said Ruskin. And if you take what he means by seeing metaphorically, you're completely missing the point. He means literally to see. This is the beginning of all wisdom, of all poetry, prophecy, and religion. So when you paint an object, say, you have to see it in the full particularity of its existence. Another 19th century man of letters, Matthew Arnold, said, you have to see it as in itself it really is. In itself and for itself, meaning not in reference to you. Not the glass of water is not an instrument for you to satisfy your desire. It is a thing in itself. But after all, it isn't just things that we tend to treat as extensions of ourselves. It's also other people. It's also other people. And art forces you to do the opposite. And it's this strange paradoxical thing where you read a book and you learn about yourself, but you learn about yourself by learning about other people. And not only are you learning about other people, but these other people that you're learning about, they aren't actually people at all. they're fictional characters. But by allowing us to experience in the most immediate and intimate way what it feels like to be somebody else, Elizabeth Bennet or Achilles or whomever, art instills the fundamental moral lesson, which is that you aren't the center of the universe, that others were not created for your benefit, that they're just as real as you with equal claims to dignity and understanding, right? Before you mind something, you have to become mindful of it. Before you genuinely care about other people and not just because you've been told that you must fight for social justice, you have to really understand that they're real people. I'm editing a little bit here because I want to return for a moment to that contrast between the sciences and the humanities, which I just sort of hinted at as a way to approach that third term in your triumvirate of themes, which is politics. It's often noted that science is cumulative while the humanities aren't, the arts are not, meaning that scientific knowledge progresses, right? Physicists today know more than physicists did yesterday or 100 years ago, which also means that science can forget its past, right? We don't study Archimedes and Galen anymore. Probably most people have never heard of Galen. But James Joyce didn't supersede William Shakespeare. And I would also add that one interpretation of Shakespeare doesn't supersede another. The arts and humanities are not progressive, which also means that they always remain available to us. And while we've forgotten about Archimedes and Galen, unless we're doing history of science, we haven't forgotten about Homer and Plato. Why is that? Think about that. Think about the fact that we can read these things from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, when all the other knowledge of that society has become completely irrelevant to us. And yet these things have not. To put it a different way, all that science can be said to know is what we know, or think we know, today, our best current picture of reality. If you try to transpose that idea to the humanities, if you say, all that the humanities can be said to know is what we know today, you recognize that the formulation is not, it's meaningless. It's not just wrong, it's, as the mathematicians say, it's not even wrong. Because the humanities don't represent our best current picture of reality, because there is no one definitive picture of reality that the humanities propose. This circumstance actually will be familiar to anyone who's taught a humanities class or even taken a humanities class, which is that there is no single right answer when you're interpreting a text. And this is I think one of the many reasons that sometimes people in the sciences have disdain for the humanities. It's like, well, so you could just say anything you want? Well, actually, you can't just say anything you want. There are wrong answers, which are answers that don't take sufficient account of the evidence of the text. There's that line from a Shakespeare sonnet that says that love is a star to every wandering bark. And, bark is a sort of archaic term for a boat, right? I've heard tell of a student once who insisted that in that line, the word bark had something to do with a dog. It's a star to every wandering bark, which is cute, but it's wrong. Still, there is no one right answer. There is no one right interpretation of that line. There is only an open-ended multiplicity of right answers, of truthful representations in art and valid interpretations in the study of art. It's not like Van Gogh made Vermeer wrong, or Rothko made Van Gogh wrong, right? They're all right. They're just all right differently. Now, why should this be? It's not an obvious thing, right? If you believe, and I do believe this, that the arts and humanities are not an inferior form of knowledge to science, or indeed not a form of knowledge at all, as some people will say, that they're merely entertainment or social capital, but rather a different form, then what do these circumstances tell us about the kind of form it is and what it is a knowledge of? And I don't think this is an easy answer, right? This is an easy question to answer. This is my preliminary understanding of it. What else does humanistic inquiry resemble? Or in plainer language, what else is the experience of reading and trying to say something sensible about a novel or a drama look like? Where else do we encounter a welter of miscellaneous circumstances, a jumble of characters, scenes, ideas, and feelings, organized within a loose, complex, and mysterious structure, through which we must navigate some kind of cognitive path, out of which we must make some kind of sense, one that we know will only be a partial and indeed a temporary sense, one possible sense out of an endless array of others, a sense that we ourselves will probably repudiate tomorrow or a year from now in favor of a different one? Well, the answer is everywhere. Every time we get up in the morning. That deliberately convoluted sentence that I just read at you, whose convolutions were meant to mimic the convolutions of the thing that it describes, that's the experience of being in the world, of being in the human world, in the world of human relationships, in the world where we establish friendships and try to experience love. And that's the function of art, especially of literary art, to reproduce, albeit in an artificial and selective way, the experience of being in the world. As George Eliot said, art is the nearest thing to life. It's always partial in both senses, just as our experience is always partial. It's always subjective, and it's always just a little piece of the whole. So art enables us to ask in an organized way, and the study of art, the humanities, helps us to start to answer in a necessarily provisional way the questions that are asked of us by life itself, the questions that are asked of us by having friendships and experiencing love, which are questions, again, that we each answer differently and differently as we progress through our lives. Science speaks to our relationship with the material world, which can be known and to an extent can be mastered, and that mastery is called technology. Culture, art and humanities, speaks to our relationship with one another. And other people can't be mastered, and in some profound sense can't ultimately be known, or can't be known fully, or can only be known provisionally. And that thing is called society. In the humanities, as in life, we're always starting from the beginning. Another remarkable thing about science versus humanities and science classrooms or humanities classrooms versus science classrooms is that in science, you almost never reappraise foundational truths. You might discuss them in a science class, but you never reappraise them. And only someone who's mastered the entire existing state of knowledge, the most advanced theoretical physicist, can reappraise the foundational truths of theoretical physics. Which is why, as I say, you never open them up to question, and undergraduate science students really almost never make fundamental contributions, often any contributions that are at all significant to the field. But as every teacher of the humanities knows, and this is really one of the great things about being a teacher of the humanities, even an undergraduate, even a freshman, even a high school student can say things about a text, true, important things, that no one has ever said before. How is this possible? People have been talking about Hamlet ever since it was written. And yet it is still possible to say new things, and to say new things without specialized knowledge. Now, all of this is to set up my big conclusion, which is that there's one more arena in which we're always asking foundational questions, those same foundational questions of value, of virtue, and that is politics. Despite what it looks like, especially today, from the nightly news, politics is the effort to construct a collective life by compounding our individual answers to foundational, moral, and philosophical questions. After all, as many of you can tell me, Aristotle didn't say that man is a social animal, because there are a lot of social animals. Termites are social animals, but they don't have elections. Bees are social animals, but they don't convene parliaments. When Aristotle said that man is a political animal, what he meant was that we have the freedom to determine what society should look like for ourselves. And here is where the connection between between politics and the liberal arts becomes clearest to me, right? Because one answer, and I'm sure you know this, to everything I've been saying about the value of the humanities, the value of the liberal arts, is like, yeah, this is great if you come from a privileged family. This is a luxury that the affluent can give themselves, give their children. But everyone else, they need to stick to something practical. Generally speaking, something that involves numbers. Now, actually, Woodrow Wilson said exactly this about a century ago. Some of you may know that he was president of Princeton before he was president of the United States. I think he actually said this in between when he was governor of New Jersey. He was speaking to a group of teachers, and he said, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class, very much larger, to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult, manual tasks." Just substitute the word technical for the word manual, and this is exactly what people are saying now. But when you put it that way, when you put it that clearly, it doesn't actually sound that good. We're going to divide society, we, whoever we is, are going to divide society into two very unequally sized groups, and one people get to have liberal education, and one people are going to forego the privileges and fit themselves. I mean, the metaphor, especially in an age of factory work, was really quite to the point. You're going to fit yourself, literally. So to me, it's not the people who are proponents of liberal education who are the elitists, right? It's the other side. And that word class is again quite to the point. To exclude people from a liberal education is to exclude them from what I've come to think of as the fields of consciousness, the fields that shape the way we think and therefore the way society looks, like journalism, the law, media, the arts, politics, public policy, education itself. To exclude them, in other words, from full political participation. About 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and I'm going to conclude with this, there was an educator in New York City named Earl Shorus. And he started something called the Clemente course in the humanities. It was at a community center in downtown Manhattan that had been named after the late baseball player Roberto Clemente. It was a course in the great books, the Western literary and philosophical classics, for poor people of color. And people thought he was crazy. These people don't need that. These people don't want it. You're wasting their time. Why would you do this? Why would anybody pay for it? In fact, the course was very successful and has been widely emulated. And a couple of years later, he wrote an essay about it called "On the Uses of a Liberal Education as a Weapon in the Hands of the Restless Poor." He said, the way out of poverty was politics. He didn't mean the way out of poverty the way we almost always talk about it now for individuals, for a lucky person from a lower income community who can get to a college like this, maybe they're on scholarship, whatever, and work their way into the middle class. That's great for the individual. It does not break the generational cycle of poverty and exclusion. For communities as such, the way out of poverty is politics, is public life. But, Shorus said, to enter the political world, to practice the political life, the poor had first to learn to reflect. I like this. He wasn't mincing words. He wasn't saying lower income people. He was saying the poor. You don't make people less poor by not calling them poor. You don't pretend that the poor had first to learn to reflect. You don't say on the one hand, college gives you all these things, and then on the other hand say, well, but you can have them even without college because you want to be sentimental about communities. He's like, no, let's get real here. The poor need to learn to think about the world and their place in the world and the way they want to change the world. And Shorus said, it's no accident that reflection, or as we might call it, philosophy, and politics, or as we might call it, democracy, emerged, at least in the West, in the same time and place, ancient Athens. And the way to learn to reflect, he said, is to study the humanities. Let me just end with a quotation from a guy named Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was the president of the University of Chicago in the 30s and 40s, and later went on to found the organization that ultimately would become PBS. So he was a big believer in that an informed citizenry was the most important bulwark of democracy. The best education for the best, he said, is the best education for all. The best education for the best is the best education for all. Thank you. Yeah, I can take it. Who's first? Yeah. Are you thinking this over? Someone else? Back there.
Hello. Oh, I'm Naomi. I was trying to put together a couple of the different ideas that you said and sort of struggling. So obviously, you're talking about the importance of having ideas of truth being challenged all the time. But you also mentioned how facts are just the solidification of an argument, and also that girl that you said you had a conversation with where you liked how she said she was going out into the world with questions. So, but I guess I'm wondering, are questions as far as we get, or what is the point of being challenged if we don't get any closer to the truth?
Right. That is itself a good question. And I'm glad you gave me the chance to clear this up. I don't think questions are all there are. I think it's important to recognize that answers are never final. There's actually this philosopher, Columbia, named Sidney Morgenbesser, who used to say, people accuse me of not having answers because I just ask questions all the time. He said, it's not that I don't have answers, I just have questions about my answers. And I think maybe behind your question is maybe the idea that if you're questioning everything all the time, you are disempowering yourself from acting.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I don't think that needs to be the case. I don't think that it is the case. But I think that to be someone who acts responsibly, you need to keep one eye on the fact that maybe you're not completely certain about everything. And I think that's, needless to say, I think that's become a real problem now. I think people are, I don't think I need to say more about that. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, I would say so. But also, what's the difference between saying that there aren't facts versus saying that there isn't truth?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I'm not saying that there really aren't facts. I'm just saying we need to recognize that a fact is not something that's fixed and frozen for all time.
Or not something that we can't get more insight about.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't think I said that there's no such a thing as truth. You see, that's one of those sort of postmodern things. Oh, I see. You're saying I didn't say that.
Yeah. No, right, I'm not saying you said that. I just didn't understand the facts part.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead. Wait for the microphone.
So I understand that, this entire lecture has kind of been about that, but if you would mind giving some thoughts on the distinction between the contemplative life and the active life and what you think about that. Like, in terms of if you have reflected on what you want to do with your life and yourself and you want to perhaps go about pursuing something in the technical or the scientific industry, or do you want to spend more time perhaps teaching, lecturing, and thinking?
Right. I don't really accept that distinction between the active and contemplative life. I think it's useful heuristically. It's kind of useful as a kind of general guide, as long as we don't take it too seriously. Because why don't I believe that? Because I think that there's an interplay between those things. And I think, for example, if your reflective life is the life of a professor, you're also acting, and you're acting as a teacher. And that's a real thing, and you're doing real things in the world. Not every action has to look the way we think of activism as looking. Although your example of action was not activism, was not changing things in the world, but becoming a professional. And here's what I would say about that, because I have thought about that. You know, what scope is there for reflection if you become, I don't know, a neurosurgeon? You know, very highly specialized technical thing. I would say a couple of things. First of all, every professional job is taken within a professional context. So an institutional context. And I think to be a responsible, I mean, we see this in the teacher strike in Oklahoma. I mean, I love those guys because first, I mean, aside from the fact that they're standing up for themselves, they're saying, we're not just standing up for ourselves. We want better pay for the people in the cafeteria, for the janitors, and we want more educational funding in general so we can have enough chairs in the classroom and enough textbooks, right? I mean, these are the result of acts of reflection. They're looking at the wider context in which their professional activity is taking place. And everyone who works has some equivalent to that. And then even beyond that, we're not just professionals. We have private lives within the context of which reflection is important, believe me, in relationships, in marital relationships, for example. And also, hopefully, we have lives as citizens where reflection will always be appropriate. Okay? Okay, perfect. How about over there?
So in your conclusion, you talk about how the liberal arts and humanities are kind of a service that should be provided to all, including the poor. How do you propose doing that? Do you think that that should be something funded and implemented in high school programming and education, or something that should be included in curriculum for technical colleges? Or do you think it's ultimately an issue of the price of education as a whole, higher ed, and not having access to that education?
I would say all of the above. Just really briefly, we did this unprecedented thing in the United States where first we moved to universal high school before any other country. And then we built, not universal college, but we had more of our citizens going to college, more Americans going to college than any other country. I think that may still be true, although we're certainly slipping. This started during the Civil War with something called the Moral Land Grant Act. That's why Clemson exists. That's why lots of public universities exist. And then we continued most famously with the GI Bill, and higher ed, like, I think the number of college students quadrupled in the 30 years after World War II. We were building colleges at the rate of one a week for about 30 years. There were economic ideas behind that, both in terms of national productivity and individual opportunity. But also, always, central to that mission was an idea of the liberal arts, always. It was never just about technical education. And the reason, and I kind of just alluded to this at the very end, was the idea that democracy requires an educated citizenry. And as we're expanding education, we're also expanding the franchise either literally or effectively. More and more people are being brought into the political process. And at the same time, all of these public systems were free, or so low cost that you could work your way through college with a part-time minimum wage job. Okay. So then in the 70s, we decided to start pulling back from all of that. And it's of a piece with this, you know, with everything, you know, with no longer investing in public physical infrastructure or parks or whatever. I think, and disinvesting K through 12, unequal funding in K through 12, not that we ever achieved that. So, yeah, what I'm talking about would require a lot of money. I think it's one of the things that we need to be spending our money on. Is that, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
This is kind of building off of what Naomi was getting at, but how can we build a soul without having some sort of guiding doxa? I mean, aren't we always going to have some sort of soul? So how do we know what we're sort of heading towards if we don't accept some sort of grounding or foundation?
No one's ever asked me that, so I'm not sure I have a good answer. Why is it necessary? Let's think about this together. Your premise seems to be that you need something to guide you in order to, but it's not immediately obvious to me that that should be the case. So help me understand this.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if you were to set out and say, I'm going to become a more educated person, you have to choose certain books to read, or you have to choose certain places to be, or I guess you have to have some vision of what you'd, like certain ideals that you'd hope to live up to. And I guess I'm not sure how you come about those ideals without having some sort of doxa to start with.
Well, as I understand it, and this might be simplistic, it's the ideals that you ultimately choose to live by. And I don't think this just happens for once and for all, but let's just say for the purpose of argument, you get to those at the end of that process. And at the beginning of the process, you start with the stuff that you've inherited. Like, this may be too simple an analogy, but a lot of what I write about is less lofty than ideals. It's just about vocational choices, right? So my father told me, you have to be a doctor. Like, that's literally what he told me. And for a long time, I thought, well, okay, I'll be a doctor. And then about halfway through college, unfortunately, I was already halfway through college, I realized, you know what, I actually don't want to be a doctor. So now what the hell am I supposed to do? And it took me a long time to figure it out, well after college ended. And I figured it out by asking myself, what do I really most love to think about or do? And that was literature and teaching, right? So I started with the certainty that my parents had handed me. I recognized that I needed to rethink it because it wasn't satisfying to me. And I consulted my own soul and went through life a little bit after college and had certain experiences that helped me figure out, like, no, I think this is what I need to do. And then that sort of process of tacking back and forth didn't stop there, actually. It seems to me that the same process is possible with larger questions. I mean, I think things become more settled as you get older, but that sort of stereotypical young adult who, like, is completely ungrounded and has no idea, like, what they believe anymore, like, that's good. I think that's good. Okay, yeah. Right there.
I think I appreciated your comments on doubt and rethinking all of our beliefs, especially in the classroom. But I was wondering, where do we draw the line? Where would you personally say we should draw the line on doubt and skepticism so that we don't degenerate into like a self-refuting type of epistemology?
I mean, you guys are asking, really.
You can recognize the infallibilists among us.
Yeah. Well, so now, what do you? I don't even know that I know what that word means. What does that word mean? Infallibilist?
I think those who know the topic better correct me if I'm wrong, but those who would hold to more of a determinate position on knowledge and truth in general. I think I'm just noticing a theme here.
Determinant? Mm-hmm. You have to explain that to me too. I'm not being silly. I really.
Okay. I think more of an absolutist. I think some of us are kind of reacting to what seems to be a non-absolutist approach to truth.
A radical anti-foundationalism?
Yes.
Right, again, and yet again, I'm not a postmodernist. I'm not actually a radical anti-foundationalist. I think those people are jerks. I do. I would say a couple of things. Partly, and I know there was no place in my sort of equations for this, but I've asked myself this question a lot, because like, well, why is murder wrong? Or, I mean, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, if you put it like that, maybe it's not wrong. I actually think that a lot of the sort of foundational stuff comes back to moral intuition. Like, if I ask myself why I choose what I think of as right and shun what I think of as wrong, not only don't I have a real argumentative answer for that, I think they're stupid. I mean, this is maybe why I'm more interested in literature than philosophy. Like, the fact that you can't, maybe it's ultimately impossible to construct a logical morality, and people fall back on utilitarianism, or they fall back on revealed religion, or whatever, that leads me to think maybe that's the wrong question. And maybe we need to accept, and this is my own personal answer, we need to accept our moral intuitions. Like, I think it's wrong because I think it's wrong. I'm a writer because that's really, did I do the math and say this is the way that I can contribute to the world the best? No, it's what seems to me to be the thing for me to do. And at a certain point, I think it's not worth questioning anymore. At the same time, and I've surprised myself with this, I think even more since I stopped being a professor, I'm not saying it's because of that, but in the last 10 years, I've come to question things that I always thought I would believe. I was one of those people who automatically thought that capitalism must be evil. And I realized, I don't think that. And I probably never thought that. But I never thought about it enough. And I could list a whole tons of things, and it's an ongoing process, too. But that doesn't bother me. I think it now would bother me if I did think that I knew things, because, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling a little bit, but that professor of mine who I quoted who said you have to think about your most exhilarating new insights, he was really my role model. He was the most intellectually alive person I'd ever met. He remained so until the day he died in his 80s, because he was never satisfied with what he thought he knew, and he was never embarrassed about not having all the answers. And that, I guess that's the question of, how do you get to the truth? You get to the truth, and then you keep going. And you recognize that it's fallible, but it's the best you have right now. Does that make any sense?
Yes, thank you. That was
Okay.
very helpful.
Okay. Right here. And then you. Go ahead. You first. Yes.
Hi, thanks. I think I might try to get at some of the questions the students are asking if I understand them from a different direction. It seemed from your talk that you were saying the point of life is to question your opinions, right? Part of the point of college, the point of life, the point of your education is to question your doxa, right? But what is the positive ideal of happiness at which this point of life aims, right? So is there something that's some image of an ideal or an sort of absolute, I don't want to put that term on it, but as an ideal of happiness that you see when you think of a life lived in that way?
I want to be clear. I don't think that the point of life is the question. I think the point of college or learning or that stage of life. And the questions don't end, but I think it's most appropriate and most intense at that stage of life. I guess the easy thing to say, but maybe the honest thing to say, is that answering that question is one of those questions. Like, what is happiness to you? And getting in touch with what makes you happy. And again, I think that also can change I think people have this experience. I think especially, classically, people who have children realize, well, something else is important to me now. Something else is what's making me happy. My own personal answer is that that's part of what makes me happy, is precisely that process of thinking and questioning. And, but I also know that other people are different. My favorite moment in Walden is not one of the moments where he's preaching the simple life and describing how he built his house, but close to the end where he says, oh, by the way, I'm not telling you that you should do all of this. First of all, you have to figure it out for yourself. And second of all, I want there to be as many different kinds of people in the world as possible, because I think he implies that's what makes the world an interesting place. I don't want everybody to be like me. I don't need everybody to have the same conception of happiness as me. Does that seem like an adequate answer to you?
I guess that's why I didn't want to go to the absolute conception of happiness, but is there an image you have before you, perhaps a character from literature or history or someone that you've known that lives a life of questioning that you think is a good life, so that there's some kind of view of an entire life lived in a happy way that drives you to do this, because you have a positive image of happiness, perhaps from...
I don't know, Socrates? It didn't seem to work out that well for him, but that wasn't his fault. I've never thought about things that way exactly. Like, who is my image? What, who represents the image of the life that I'd want to live? And I don't mean to sound full of myself, but I had a writing teacher who said, so let's talk about your writing. Who do you aspire to write like? And I said, I don't. I want to try to write like myself. So, I mean, we can point to Socrates, but it's not like I want to live his life. I think that's a big mistake that people make. I'm also not sure that making happiness the goal is the smartest thing either, right? I think it's only something that comes to you indirectly, right? Yeah. There was, really? Okay. I'll stay for as long as, we're going to let people go. Okay.
Well, thank you for coming today. I just had a question about, once again, I'm going to go back to the every fact is created by an argument, or it's a frozen argument. Recently, especially anyone that follows a lot of pop culture, the phrase your truth or follow your truth or pursue your truth, as opposed to find out what the truth, has been something that's been permeating culture a lot. And I've sort of scoffed at that notion internally, thinking that there is either the truth or there is something that you're interpreting but isn't the truth. Where do you fall on the whole following your own truth or finding an individual's truth, or what is the truth?
Right, I think that's a great question. I tend to be very skeptical of that phrase too, because it seems to be used really absolutistically. I think it's obvious and maybe important to say that people's subjective truths are valid. They are their truths, and you can't negate someone's subjective truth. At the same time, we need to recognize that not every truth is a subjective truth. And to say that every fact is a frozen argument, it's not a frozen feeling, it's a frozen argument. And Neil deGrasse Tyson says that, the good thing about science is that it's true whether you believe it or not. It doesn't matter whether you believe it, right? So, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I guess that's it. Okay.